The voicemail came in at 6:42 on a Sunday morning, and I knew before I pressed play that it was bad, because nobody in my family calls before noon unless something has gone wrong or somebody wants something. It was my daughter. "Don't come Thanksgiving," she said, and her voice had that flat, rehearsed quality, like she'd practiced it in the shower. "We talked about it, all of us, and we think you need to give us room to be our own family for once. You make everything heavy. Just stay home this year." Then a pause. Then, softer, almost an afterthought. "We'll figure out the money stuff later." That last part was the part that knocked the wind out of me, because it told me she'd thought about the money before she'd thought about me. I sat at my kitchen table in my robe and I listened to it 3 more times. I'm not a stupid woman. I worked 31 years in the billing department of a county hospital, and I can read between lines for a living. But I kept hoping I'd hear something different the 4th time, some warmth I'd missed. There wasn't any. So I got up. I made my coffee the way I always do, 2 scoops, splash of half and half, in the mug my husband gave me the Christmas before he passed. The one with the chickadee on it that's half rubbed off now from 12 years of my thumb. And then I sat back down and I opened my banking app, and one by one I turned off every automatic transfer I'd been sending my children for the better part of a decade. The mortgage assist for my daughter, the car payment for my son, the miscellaneous standing transfer that we both pretended wasn't just spending money. I turned them all off, and my hand wasn't even shaking. That's the thing nobody tells you. Sometimes the worst moments come with a strange, quiet steadiness, like your body already made the decision and your mind is just catching up. By Tuesday morning, both their cars were in my driveway, but I'm getting ahead of myself, and if you'll let me, I'd like to tell you how a woman who spent 40 years apologizing for taking up space finally decided to stop. My name is Maren Holloway. I'm 66 years old, and I live in a little brick rancher in Dayton, Ohio, on the same street where I raised my 2 kids. My husband Paul died 12 years ago of pancreatic cancer, and it was fast, mercifully fast, 4 months from the diagnosis to the morning I woke up next to a man who wasn't breathing anymore. We were married 38 years. People say you get used to the empty side of the bed. You don't. You just stop expecting it to fill back up. Paul was a high school shop teacher. Steady, patient, the kind of man who could fix anything except his own pride, which he didn't have much of to begin with. He believed in earning things. He used to say, and I can still hear him, "Maren, the kindest thing you can do for a kid is let them feel the weight of their own choices." I'd nod. I'd agree with him out loud. And then the second he left the room, I'd slip our daughter a 20 for gas, or do our son's college applications for him because he wasn't a writer, or call the school to smooth over some mess he'd made. I loved my children the way you love a wound, by constantly touching it to see if it still hurt. We have 2. My daughter is the older one, 40 now, married to a man who sells commercial insurance and has never once looked me in the eye when he shakes my hand. They have 2 girls, my granddaughters, who are the 2 best reasons I have left to get out of bed. My son is 37, divorced, no kids, lives an hour away in Columbus and works in what he calls sales, and what I've come to understand is a rotating series of jobs that never quite stick. After Paul died, I had his life insurance, his pension, and the house paid off. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable for a woman who didn't need much. And in those first awful months when the grief was so loud I couldn't hear myself think, my children started calling more. I told myself it was because they missed their father too. I let myself believe we were getting closer. Looking back now, I think what they smelled was the money, the way deer smell a salt lick. It started small. It always does. My daughter called one night that first winter crying and said her husband's commission had come in light and they were going to be short on the mortgage. I had the money. Of course I had the money. Of course I had the money. I transferred it that night, and the next morning she called and told me I was a lifesaver, that she didn't know what they'd have done, that I was the best mother in the whole world. And God help me, I needed those words more than air. Because here's the thing I've learned about grief, that nobody warns you about. It doesn't just take the person. It takes your sense of who you are. I'd been Paul's wife for 38 years, and then I was nobody's wife. And being somebody's lifesaver felt like the closest thing to having a purpose again. So I did it again, and again. When my son's transmission went, I covered it. When my daughter's youngest needed dental work that insurance wouldn't touch, I covered it. Then it stopped being emergencies and started being a calendar event. My daughter, ever practical, said, "Mom, why don't we just set up something automatic so you're not getting these stressful calls?" As if the calls had ever stressed me. As if the calls hadn't been the only time she called at all. But I said yes, because saying yes was the only language we still spoke fluently to each other. $800 a month to her household. Then my son wanted the same, and what was I going to do, help one and not the other? $500 a month to him, and then the extras on top, the birthdays, the just this once school trips, the time my son's apartment flooded, and I wrote him a check for $2,000 I never saw a receipt for. Over 9 years. I added it up once, sitting right here at this table with a legal pad, and the number I came to was a little over $220,000, more than I'd made some entire years of my working life, gone, into the great hungry mouth of being needed. I told myself it was love. I told myself it was what Paul would have wanted, taking care of our family. But somewhere in the last year, a little voice had started up in the back of my head, a voice that sounded a lot like Paul's, and it kept asking me the same quiet question. Would he have wanted this? Not the money. Paul never cared about money. Would he have wanted to watch me disappear, one transfer at a time, until I was nothing but a checkbook with a pulse? The first real warning was last Easter, and I was too lonely to read it for what it was. I'd spent 2 days cooking. Ham with Paul's mother's brown sugar glaze, the scalloped potatoes that take forever, deviled eggs, the works. I'd set the dining room table with the good plates, the ones we'd registered for in 1985 and used maybe a dozen times since. My daughter's family was supposed to come at 1. They rolled in at 3:45. My son-in-law walked past me into my own living room and turned on my own television to check a football score without so much as a hello. My granddaughters hugged me, which was the only good part of the whole day. We sat down to eat at 4:30, and within 10 minutes, every adult at that table was on a phone. I'd cooked for 2 days, and the meal was over in 19 minutes because my granddaughter timed it as a joke. And nobody laughed but me. And I wasn't really laughing. My daughter scraped half her plate into my trash on the way out. "It's a lot of food for just leftovers, Mom," she said, like she was doing me a favor. They were gone by 5:30. My son didn't come at all. He texted at 4 that something had come up. The something, I found out later, was a fishing trip. I stood in my kitchen that evening with my hands in dishwater up to the wrist, looking at a ham that would feed me alone for 2 weeks. And I felt the loneliest I had felt since the morning Paul stopped breathing. But I rinsed the good plates and put them away, and I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself families get busy. I told myself a lot of things that Easter that I no longer tell myself. Then came the voicemail, the one about Thanksgiving, the one where my own daughter, in 22 seconds, told me I made everything heavy and then reminded herself about the money. I want to tell you what was in my head when I turned off those transfers, because it wasn't rage. I wish I could tell you it was some grand, righteous fury, but it wasn't. It was the strangest, saddest clarity. I thought about a girl I used to be, the one Paul married, a woman who'd put herself through bookkeeping classes at night and once told off her own boss for shorting the overnight nurses on their pay. I'd been a person once. Somewhere in the years of being the mother, and then a widow, and then a wallet, I'd misplaced her. And sitting there in my robe, I had the oddest feeling that she was still in the house somewhere, waiting for me to come find her. So I turned everything off. And then I did one more thing. I called my attorney's office and left a message asking to come in and talk about my will, which at that point left everything split evenly between my 2 children. I didn't know yet what I wanted to change. I just knew that I didn't want to keep rewarding people for treating me like furniture. Tuesday morning, 8:15, the doorbell rang and rang. My daughter was on the porch, and her husband's truck was at the curb, and my son's car pulled in behind it as I was opening the door, which meant they coordinated. After months of not coordinating so much as a phone call to check on me, they'd managed to coordinate this. "Mom," my daughter said, pushing past me into the house. "What is going on? The mortgage transfer didn't go through. The bank says it was canceled. Did you get hacked?" "No," I said. "I canceled it." She stopped. She actually stopped moving, which I'd never seen her do, and turned around. "You what?" "I canceled all of them," I said. My voice was very calm. I remember being surprised by how calm. Yours, your brother's, all of it. I turned them off Sunday morning, after I got your message. My son came in then, and the two of them stood in my living room, the room where I'd rocked them both as babies, and they looked at me like I was a stranger who'd broken in. "This is insane," my son said. "You can't just cut us off. We have lives. We have bills." "You're 40 and 37, I said. "You have jobs. You have, between the two of you, 3 adults working full-time. And every single month for 9 years I have sent you money that I now realize you are never going to stop needing because I never made you stop." "Mom," my daughter said, and she pivoted so fast it gave me whiplash. Suddenly soft, suddenly the little girl who used to climb in my lap during thunderstorms. "Is this about the voicemail? Because I was stressed when I left that. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Of course we want you at Thanksgiving." And there it was. 3 days. It took 3 days and the loss of $800 for me to go from somebody she couldn't bear to see to somebody she desperately wanted at her table. Not because she'd missed me, because she'd done the math. "You said I make everything heavy," I said. "Mom." "That twine. You said you needed room to be your own family. And then you said, and I have it saved, you said you'd figure out the money stuff later." I looked at my son. "And you said nothing at all. You always say nothing. Your silence has cost me as much as her words." My son had the grace, at least, to look at the floor. Then it got ugly, the way these things do. My daughter cried, and when the crying didn't move me, she got cold. And when the cold didn't move me, she got cruel. She told me I was bitter. She told me I was using money to control them, which struck me as a remarkable thing to say to the person whose money you'd been controlling your whole adult life. And then she said the thing I'll never forget, the thing my granddaughter's mother said to me in my own living room. "Fine," she said, picking up her purse. "But don't come crying to us when you're old and alone and there's nobody to take care of you. You'll be in some home and we won't come." The room went very quiet. Even my son looked at her. And here is the part I'm not proud of and the part I'm most proud of, both at once. I didn't yell. I walked to my front door and I opened it, and I held it open, and I said, "If you're already planning not to visit me in the home, then you've already shown me what your visits would be worth." I said, "Go." And they went. My son hesitated at the door just for a second, and I thought he might say something, and he didn't. And that hesitation told me everything I needed to know about how much I'd let him get away with by mistaking his silence for shyness. The house was very quiet after. I want to tell you, I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt like I'd had surgery. Hollow and sore and not yet sure what they'd taken out of me. I sat in Paul's old recliner, which I still can't bring myself to get rid of, and I cried until I didn't have any more in me. And then I got up and I made myself a sandwich because grief or no grief, a body has to eat. I'd love to say it got better fast. It didn't. The first few weeks were the loneliest of my life since Paul. The silence where the phone calls used to be was deafening, even though I knew those calls had only ever been about money. There's a particular cruelty in losing something that was already hurting you. You miss the hurt because at least the hurt was a kind of company. What saved me, honestly, was the smallest thing. My next-door neighbor, a retired letter carrier I'd waved at for 11 years and never really talked to, saw me sitting on my porch one evening and came over with 2 cans of root beer and said, "You look like a woman who could use somebody to not talk to." And we sat there, the two of us, not talking, watching the streetlights come on. Her name is Florine, and she has become, at 68, the best friend I've made in 30 years. She's the one who dragged me to the community center, where I signed up for a watercolor class on a Tuesday and a chair yoga class on a Thursday, and discovered, to my genuine shock, that I had a life that could exist without my children's emergencies in it. I met people. A widower named Dale who fixes clocks and brought one of mine back to life. A woman named Tess who'd raised 5 kids and cut off 3 of them and had absolutely no regrets, and told me so over coffee in a way that felt like permission. I started painting badly and then less badly. I joined a book club that mostly drinks wine and gossips, and I cannot tell you the last time I laughed the way I laughed at that book club. And slowly the strangest thing happened. The version of me that I thought was still hiding in the house somewhere, she started coming back. I'd catch her in the mirror. I'd hear her in the way I said no to a telemarketer without apologizing 4 times. She was tougher than I remembered. She was funnier. She'd been waiting a long time. My children didn't call for 2 months. Then my son called, and I could hear in the first 3 words that he was in trouble. He'd lost the job, the most recent one. He was behind on his rent. He didn't ask for money outright. He was smarter than that now. He just laid out the situation and let it sit there, the way he always had, waiting for me to fill the silence with a checkbook. And I'll tell you, every cell in my body wanted to. That's the part they don't warn you about. The love doesn't go away just because the relationship is sick. It would have been so easy. A few clicks and his rent would be handled, and he'd call me a lifesaver, and I'd feel needed for an afternoon. Instead, I said, "That sounds really hard, honey. What's your plan?" There was a long silence. He didn't have a plan. He'd never needed one, and I let that silence stay there. His, this time, instead of mine. And finally he said he guessed he'd start looking for work, and I said that sounded like a good first step, and I told him I loved him, and I meant it, and I did not send him a dime. He didn't call again for a while. But here's the thing I learned that I wish somebody had told me at 40 instead of 66. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a drowning person is stop letting them stand on your shoulders. My son found a job at a building supply warehouse. It pays less than the sales jobs ever promised, but it's honest and it's steady, and after about 4 months he called me, and this time he didn't lead with a problem. He led with, "How are you doing, Mom?" And then he actually waited for the answer. We talked for 40 minutes. He asked about my painting. He remembered I'd taken it up. I almost dropped the phone. My daughter took longer. Pride runs deep in her, deeper than it ever did in me, and I think a part of her genuinely believed I'd crack, that I'd come crawling back with my checkbook open the way I always had. When I didn't, she got angrier before she got better. There was a hard stretch where she kept the girls from me, and that nearly broke my resolve, because punishing me by withholding my granddaughters was the one weapon that actually drew blood. I called the girl's father, my son-in-law, the man who never looked me in the eye, and I said plainly, "Whatever is going on between your wife and me, those girls deserve their grandmother, and I deserve them." And to my everlasting surprise, he agreed. He started bringing them over himself on Saturday afternoons. Turns out the man had more spine than I'd given him credit for. Turns out a lot of people did, once I stopped doing all their work for them. It was nearly a year before my daughter and I sat in the same room again. She came to one of the Saturday visits, hung back by the door like she wasn't sure she was allowed in. The girls ran to me, and over their heads, my daughter looked at me, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen since she was small. She looked unsure of herself. Humbled, maybe, by a year of standing on her own 2 feet without the safety net she'd never thanked me for. We didn't fix it that day. I want to be honest with you, because the stories that wrap up neat with a bow are lies, and you deserve better than lies. We didn't hug and weep and become best friends, but she stayed for the whole visit. And at the end, in the driveway, she said, "The girls really miss you when they don't see you," which was as close to an apology as she could get to that day, and I decided to take it as the small bridge it was. It's been almost 2 years now. My daughter and I have coffee once a month. Sometimes it's stiff. Once it was good enough that we both cried in the parking lot afterward. The good kind, the kind that clears something out. She's never paid back a cent, and I've stopped expecting her to, because I've come to understand the money was never the real debt. The real debt was respect, and you can't wire that into an account. But she calls now to ask how I am, not how much I can spare, and some days that feels like more money than I ever sent her. My son is steadier than I've ever seen him. He came for Christmas this year, my first real Christmas in over a decade, the kind with people in the house who wanted to be there. Flooring came, and Dale brought a clock he'd fixed as a gift, and Tess showed up with a pie and a story that made my book club blush. My granddaughters made paper snowflakes that are still taped to my windows. My son carved the roast, Paul's recipe, the one I'd made every Christmas of our marriage, and when he plated the first slice, he set it down in front of me and said, "You first, Mom," and I had to leave the room for a minute so nobody would see my face. I did change my will, by the way, not to punish anybody. I split it 3 ways now instead of 2, a third to my son, a third in a trust for my granddaughter's education that their parents can't touch, and a third to a scholarship fund at the community center for women starting over after 60, because Lord knows, I wish somebody had funded that for me. My daughter knows. She didn't fight it. She said, "That's fair, Mom," and I think it might be the first genuinely selfless sentence she's ever said to me. People ask if I regret cutting them off. I tell them the truth, which is that I regret that I had to, but I've never once regretted that I did. I spent $220,000 and 9 years of my life trying to buy a love that was never for sale, and the day I stopped paying, I started living. I paint most mornings now. I'm not good, but I'm getting braver, which is better than good. I sleep through the night. I have a friend next door who knows how I take my coffee, and a man named Dale who looks at me across the table the way Paul used to. And I'm not in any hurry, but I'm not closing any doors either. Last week, I found the chickadee mug pushed to the back of the cabinet, and I got it down and ran my thumb over the worn-off spot the way I have 10,000 times. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was holding on to Paul. I felt like he was handing something to me. I could almost hear him, that patient shop teacher voice. The kindest thing you can do for a kid is let them feel the weight of their own choices, Marin. I just never thought the kid he meant might turn out to be me. I'm 66. I gave away a small fortune and got something better back. I got myself. And every morning I wake up in a quiet house that doesn't feel empty anymore, just peaceful, and I make my coffee. 2 scoops, splash of half and half, and a mug with half a chickadee on it, and I begin a day that finally, after all these years, belongs to me. I used to think love and money were the same language, that if I'd just kept sending enough, my children would keep loving me back. It took losing them for a while to understand that I had taught them the lesson myself. Every transfer I made was a sentence in a story I've been writing for 9 years, and the story said, "You don't have to grow, because I'll catch you." So they didn't grow. That wasn't their failure first. It was mine. Cause and effect is patient, but it never misses. You water entitlement long enough, it blooms, and then you stand in your own living room shocked at the flower. The hardest thing I ever did was not the cutting off. It was sitting in Paul's old recliner those first weeks, hollow and aching, and choosing not to undo it the next morning when the loneliness told me to. My son called with that familiar silence, waiting for me to fill it with a check, and everything in me wanted to. Holding still in that moment took more out of me than 31 years of working full-time ever did. But that's where the change actually happened, not in the dramatic gesture, but in the boring daily refusal to go back to who I'd been. What I'd lost somewhere along the way was the simple clarity to tell kindness apart from rescue. They are not the same. Kindness lets a grown man feel the weight of his own choices. Rescue robs him of the very thing that would make him a man. When I finally learned to ask my son, "What's your plan?" instead of reaching for my checkbook, I gave him something my money never could. I gave him back to himself. The smartest love I ever practiced looked, at first, like the cruelest. And I had to find my own backbone before I could expect either of my children to find theirs. You cannot give a person something you do not own. For years I'd had no spine to lend, so I lent money instead. Because money was easier than the long, frightening work of becoming someone who could simply say no and survive the silence afterward. Flooring taught me that with 2 cans of root beer and a porch. Dale taught me that a person could look at me and see worth, not a wallet. Paul, all those years gone, had been trying to teach me the whole time, and I was finally quiet enough to hear him. If you are sitting where I sat, paying for a love that keeps raising its price, I want you to know the math never works. You will never send enough. The day I stopped trying was the day I started living, and my children, freed from leaning, slowly learned to stand. We are not fully healed, but we are honest now, and honest is a foundation you can actually build a family on. I gave away a small fortune chasing their approval. I got something better when I stopped. I got my own respect back. And it turns out that was the one thing worth keeping all along.